They found the bodies at first light, arranged in a circle like offerings to a god no white man understood. 12 scalped corpses, their rifles planted upright in the sand beside them, barrels down like grave markers. The desert wind had already begun its work, covering boot prints with red dust, erasing evidence of how quickly death had come. But the message carved into the surrounding stones needed no translation. You were seen. You were judged. You were found wanting. Samuel Garrett stood at the edge of the killing ground, his hand trembling as he held the reins of his horse. The animal wouldn't go closer, snorting and stamping against the smell of old blood mixed with creosote and sage. Sam was 19, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, and this was supposed to be his first real job, riding with the Henderson Trading Company's caravan from San Antonio to El Paso. Easy money, they'd told him. Safe route, they'd promised. Nobody mentioned finding a massacre before breakfast. "Don't touch nothing," growled Marcus Webb, the caravan master. He was a thick-shouldered man with sun-damaged skin that looked like old leather, and eyes that had seen enough frontier violence to recognize when it carried a warning. "This here's Apache work. Clean, professional. They want us to see this." "Why?" Sam's voice cracked. He hated himself for it. Webb spat tobacco juice into the sand. "Because these boys weren't traders. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you." Look at the wagon tracks. 4 heavy wagons, reinforced axles. That's transport equipment. These men were slave hunters. The words settled over the scene like a shroud. Sam had heard stories about the hunters, rough men who operated in the gray spaces between Texas law and Mexican territory, capturing anyone they could sell. Escaped slaves, free blacks with forged papers, sometimes even Tejanos and Indians who couldn't prove their freedom fast enough. The plantation owners in East Texas paid well, and they didn't ask questions about paperwork. "Apache don't usually scalp," said Mary Thornton, the only woman in their caravan. She ran a small general store in El Paso and made this trip twice a year, afraid of nothing and no one. She walked between the bodies without flinching, examining the scene like a detective. They take who? Take weapons, take horses, but scalping, that's personal, that's European. "They're learning from us," Webb said quietly, "giving us back what we taught them." Sam forced himself to look at the nearest body. The man had been middle-aged, probably, though it was hard to tell now. His clothes were decent, not rich, but not poor either. A working man's outfit, the kind of person you might see in any frontier town, buying supplies or sharing a drink. Except this one had made his living stealing other people's lives, and now he'd paid for it in the currency he understood best. "We need to report this," Sam said. The army won't do shit." Mary cut him off. She was crouched by a set of tracks that led away from the circle, deeper into the desert. "They're already spread thin, trying to protect the settlements. You think they're going to chase Apache warriors into the mountains over 12 dead slave hunters? They'll file a report and forget about it by Tuesday." Webb nodded grimly. "She's right, and if we're smart, we'll do the same. Load up, move fast, and don't make camp anywhere near Apache territory until we're clear of the Pecos." But Sam couldn't move. He was staring at something half-buried near one of the bodies, a length of chain, heavy iron links meant for human necks. The sand had drifted over most of it, but he could see where it ended, attached to a metal collar, still locked shut, empty now. Whoever had worn it was gone. "They freed them," Sam whispered. "The prisoners. The Apache freed them." Mary stood up, dusting off her hands. "Of course they did. That's the whole point. This wasn't a raid for horses or supplies. This was a rescue mission that turned into an execution." She looked at Webb. "You know what that means." Webb's jaw tightened. Means there's a war chief out there who's smart enough to track hunters and patient enough to wait for the right moment. Means he's got warriors who can move silent enough to take down 12 armed men without a single gunshot. He climbed back onto his wagon. And it means we're leaving, now. As they prepared to depart, Sam took one last look at the scene. The morning sun was rising higher, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, riding the thermals above the mesas. It was beautiful country, vast and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. People came here thinking they could bend it to their will, thinking their guns and their commerce gave them ownership, but the land remembered, and apparently so did the Apache. The caravan moved out, wagon wheels creaking against the rutted trail. They traveled in silence for the first hour, each person lost in their own thoughts. Sam kept replaying the scene in his mind, trying to make sense of the mathematics of violence. 12 men, probably armed with rifles and pistols, experienced in conflict, eliminated without apparent struggle. How many Apache warriors would that take? How long had they watched and waited? And more importantly, what happened to the people they'd freed? It was Mary who finally broke the silence. She'd been riding alongside Webb's wagon, but now she urged her horse back to where Sam rode at the rear. "You're wondering if they're still out there," she said. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded. "Wouldn't you be? If I was Apache and I'd just killed 12 men, I'd want to make sure no one followed." "They're out there," Mary confirmed. "Been watching us since we left the killing ground. 3 riders, maybe 4. Keeping to the high rocks where the shadows run deep." She saw Sam's hand move toward his rifle. "Don't! They're not interested in us. We're not hunters. We're not soldiers. We're just travelers passing through their land." "How can you be sure?" "Because we're still alive." Mary's voice was matter of fact. "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. Apache don't miss and they don't hesitate. What happened back there was deliberate, calculated. They chose those men specifically." Webb called back from the lead wagon. "Mary's right. I fought alongside Apache scouts during the Mexican troubles. Best warriors I ever saw. Disciplined, honorable, deadly. They don't kill for sport. Everything means something." Sam wanted to believe that. He wanted to think there was logic to the violence, rules that made sense. But he'd grown up hearing different stories, tales of savage raids, burned homesteads, settlers killed without mercy. His uncle had lost a ranch near Corpus Christi to what people called an Indian attack. The newspapers called them savages, barbarians, threats to civilization. But then again, his uncle had also bragged about hunting buffalo for sport, leaving hundreds of carcasses to rot on the plains. And the slave hunters they'd found that morning, what were they but another kind of savage wearing different clothes? The desert stretched ahead of them, endless and unforgiving. Sam realized he'd been thinking about ownership all wrong. Nobody owned this land. The Apache didn't own it. The Texans didn't own it. Mexico didn't own it. The land simply existed, and humans fought over the temporary privilege of surviving on it. The question wasn't who had the right to be here, it was who had the right to decide who else could be here. And apparently 12 men had decided they had that right, decided they could take people and sell them like cattle, decided the profit was worth the risk. They'd been wrong. As the sun reached its apex and the heat became oppressive, Webb called a halt near a rocky outcropping that provided shade. They watered the horses and ate a quick meal of dried meat and hardtack. Sam noticed that Mary kept scanning the horizon, her hand never far from the pistol at her belt. "You said you've done this route twice a year," Sam said, approaching her. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Mary considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, I saw something similar near Fort Davis. Different group of hunters, different ending. The army caught up with them before the Apache did, arrested them for operating without proper authority. 3 months later, they were back out here doing the same thing with new papers. The law doesn't stop men like that. Fear does. Pain does. Death does. She looked at Sam with eyes that had seen too much. "You're young. You still think the world runs on rules and justice. It doesn't. It runs on power and consequence. Those men back there learned that lesson too late. But killing them was justice," Mary interrupted firmly. "Not the kind you read about in law books, but the kind that actually matters. They stole lives. They broke families. They sold human beings for profit. What punishment would you suggest? A fine, a stern lecture. These men operated outside the law because the law didn't care enough to stop them, so someone else did. Uday Webb called them back to the wagons. They still had miles to cover before nightfall, and he wanted to be well clear of the area before they made camp." As they prepared to move out, Sam noticed something that made his blood run cold. A line of stones arranged on a nearby boulder pointing southwest. Fresh stones, recently placed. "Webb," he called out, his voice tight. "We're being guided." The caravan master came over, studied the stones, and cursed softly. "Apache trail markers. They want us going southwest, away from the main trail." He looked at the terrain ahead, calculating distances and dangers. Could be they're warning us away from something. Could be they're herding us into an ambush. Or, Mary said quietly, they're showing us the safe path, the one that doesn't cross hunting grounds or sacred sites. Webb stood silent for a long moment, weighing options. Finally, he made his decision. "We follow the markers, but we stay alert, weapons ready, and if anything feels wrong, we run." He looked at his small caravan. 2 wagons, 5 people, horses tired from the morning's tension. Not enough to fight if it came to that, just enough to die quickly if they made the wrong choice. They turned southwest. The markers appeared every half-mile, stones arranged in patterns that only someone who knew to look for them would notice. An arrowhead shape here, a line pointing there, subtle redirections that took them deeper into terrain that didn't appear on any map Sam had ever seen. The land changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged, more isolated, fewer wagon ruts, fewer signs of human passage. This was country people avoided, either from wisdom or fear. By late afternoon, they descended into a canyon system that cut through the desert like scars on ancient skin. Red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, providing blessed shade, but also boxing them in. If this was a trap, it was a perfect one. No escape, no room to maneuver, nothing but forward or back. "I don't like this," muttered James Crawford, one of the other teamsters. He was a nervous man on the best of days, constantly checking his weapons and jumping at shadows. "We're rats in a barrel here." "We're guests," Mary corrected, "being shown a path. There's a difference." "How can you tell?" "Because we're still breathing." The canyon opened suddenly into a wider space, a natural amphitheater where water had carved out a basin over countless centuries. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a single figure. The Apache warrior sat motionless on his horse, watching them approach. He wore traditional clothing, deerskin leggings, a cotton shirt, a red band tied around his head. His face was painted with white clay in patterns Sam didn't recognize, and his eyes held the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence. He carried no visible weapons, but Sam had no doubt he could produce a knife or tomahawk faster than thought. Webb brought the caravan to a halt 50 feet away. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a canyon wren and the nervous shifting of horses. Then the warrior raised his right hand, palm forward, a gesture of peace. Webb returned it slowly and carefully. "Do you speak English?" he called out. "I speak many languages." The warrior's voice was clear, educated, surprising. "I learned English from missionaries, Spanish from traders, French from trappers who thought they could steal from my people without consequence." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "They were wrong. We're just passing through," Webb said. "We mean no harm to your people." "I know. I have been watching you since dawn. You found our message. The dead hunters." "Yes." The warrior urged his horse forward a few steps. They had been hunting my people for 3 seasons, taking the young ones, the ones who strayed too far from camp, selling them to plantations in the east. Last winter they took my sister. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sam felt something twist in his chest. Not fear now, but recognition. This wasn't mindless violence. This was personal. This was grief and rage and love, all bound together in an act of desperate justice. "I'm sorry," Webb said, and Sam could tell he meant it. "Truly, what those men did was permitted by your laws," the warrior interrupted. "Your government made treaties saying we would be left in peace. Then your hunters came anyway. Your soldiers looked away. Your merchants bought the people they stole. Tell me, which is the savage? The one who takes revenge or the one who profits from slavery?" No one had an answer to that. The warrior studied them for another moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "My name is Taza. I am war chief of the Mescalero Apache. The men you found were the last of the hunting party that took my sister. We tracked them for 60 days. We watched them cage 3 more people, a young mother and her 2 children, escaped slaves seeking freedom in Mexico. We waited until they made camp, until they felt safe. Then we freed the prisoners and gave the hunters the death they had earned." "Where's your sister now?" Mary asked quietly. Taza's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "We found her 3 weeks ago. She was working in the cotton fields near Nacogdoches. When we approached, she did not recognize me. The plantation owner had renamed her, beaten the Apache out of her, made her forget who she was." He paused. "She is with our grandmother now, remembering. It will take time." "And the others you freed?" Webb asked. "The mother and children?" "Safe, heading south with guides who know the way to Mexico. They will have new names, new lives. The chains are broken." Taza looked at each of them in turn. "I tell you this so you understand. What we did was not random violence. It was justice, the kind your people understand. Measured, proportional, final." Sam found his voice. "The army will come looking. When they find those bodies, they will find a warning." Taza's voice was hard. "Tell your army this: the hunting is over. Any man who enters Apache lands seeking to capture and sell human beings will meet the same fate. We do not care about their uniforms, their papers, their excuses. The old ways said we should avoid white men, stay hidden, survive quietly. But my sister's eyes taught me a new lesson. Silence is permission. If we do not fight, we agree to our own extinction." Webb nodded slowly. "I'll carry your message, but you should know, there are men in Austin and San Antonio who won't accept it. They'll send soldiers, real ones. This will escalate." "Let it." Taza's jaw set firm. "We are ready. My warriors are ready. We have been ready since the first Spanish conquistador set foot on our land, claiming ownership of the earth itself. If your people want war, they will have it. But they should know, we do not lose in these mountains. We do not surrender in these canyons. This is our home. We were born from this rock and dust. We will die here before we let others tell us how to live." Mary spoke up, her voice respectful but firm. "Then why guide us? Why show us the safe path? We're white travelers. By your logic, we're the enemy. You are not hunters. You are not soldiers. You are not settlers claiming land that was never for sale." Taza's expression softened slightly. "My grandmother taught me that the world has space for many peoples, many ways of living. The problem is not white skin or brown skin or black skin. The problem is the disease you call civilization, the belief that one group of humans has the right to own another, that profit justifies any cruelty, that power makes morality." He looked directly at Sam. "You are young. You still have time to choose which kind of human you will become." The words struck Sam like a physical blow. All his life, he'd been told simple stories. Good people and bad people, civilization and savagery, progress and primitivism. But standing in this canyon, Looking at this warrior who spoke 3 languages and quoted philosophy while his people fought for survival, Sam realized the stories had been lies, or at least they'd been incomplete. "There's a settlement 2 days south," Taza said, returning to practical matters. "Follow this canyon until it splits, take the western branch, and you'll find a trading post run by a man named Hector Vasquez. He's neutral ground, trades with Apache, trades with whites, trades with anyone who comes in peace. You'll be safe there." He began to turn his horse. "But do not go back the way you came. The desert remembers everything. It knows who travels with honor and who travels with blood on their hands." "Wait," Sam called out before he could stop himself. "Your sister, what was her name, her real name?" Taza looked back, surprised by the question. For the first time, something like warmth entered his eyes. "Danahe. It means she laughs. When she was young, before all this, she would laugh at everything, the wind, the birds, her own reflection in the stream. That is who I fight to bring back. Not just her body, but her laughter." He raised his hand again, the gesture of peace now somehow also a gesture of farewell and warning and hope all at once. Then he turned and rode out of the clearing, moving so smoothly it seemed like he and the horse were one creature, born together in these ancient canyons. They waited until he was out of sight before anyone spoke. "Well," Mary said finally, "that was either the most honest conversation I've had in years or the most elaborate warning before an ambush." Webb shook his head. "No ambush. If he wanted us dead, we'd be dead. That was something else. A moment of understanding, maybe. Or a glimpse of a different world, one where people talk before they kill." "Do we really carry his message?" Crawford asked. "To the army?" "We do," Webb said firmly. "Not because I think they'll listen, but because he deserves that much. He could have killed us for being white. He could have robbed us for being rich enough to afford wagons. Instead, he talked to us like humans. The least we can do is extend the same courtesy." They moved out, following Taza's directions. The canyon did split, and they took the western branch as instructed. The sun was beginning to set, painting the rock walls in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost supernatural. Sam rode in silence, his mind churning with everything he'd witnessed. 2 days ago, he'd been a simple teamster's assistant, excited about earning real money and seeing the frontier. Now he'd seen a dozen corpses arranged like a sermon, spoken with an Apache war chief about justice and revenge, and confronted the uncomfortable truth that the people he'd been taught to fear might be more honorable than the people he'd been taught to trust. That night, they made camp in a sheltered spot where rock overhangs provided both protection and concealment. Webb posted guards but told them to watch for human movement, not Apache. "They've already decided what to do with us," he explained. "We're either under their protection or beneath their notice. Either way, making a fuss won't help." Sam volunteered for second watch, knowing he wouldn't sleep anyway. He sat on a boulder overlooking their camp, rifle across his knees, staring out at the vast darkness of the desert night. The stars here were different than in the settled parts of Texas. Brighter, more numerous, ancient light from dead suns that had been traveling for years just to reach his eyes. Mary joined him sometime after midnight, bringing coffee that tasted like burnt dirt but was hot and welcome. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Keep thinking about what he said, about choosing what kind of human to become." "That's because you're smart enough to understand what he meant." Mary sipped her coffee. "Most people hear a story like ours, and they'll focus on the violence. 12 dead men, Apache on the warpath, danger in the territories. They'll miss the actual point. Which is that we're all choosing every day whether to be the hunter or the protester, whether to take what we want because we have the power, or to consider whether having power means we should." She looked at him. Those slave hunters, they chose. They looked at other human beings and saw profit. They looked at families and saw inventory, And they did it because society told them it was acceptable, even admirable. They were entrepreneurs, risk-takers, self-made men. Her voice dripped with disgust. But Taza saw them differently. He saw criminals who'd stolen his sister and destroyed his family, and he chose too. Revenge. Justice, Mary corrected. There's a difference. Revenge is about anger. Justice is about balance. Taza didn't kill random white people. He didn't attack our caravan or raid settlements. He tracked down the specific men who'd harmed his people and held them accountable when no one else would. She finished her coffee. In a better world, there'd be courts for this, laws that applied equally to everyone. But we don't live in that world, do we? We live in one where the law protects some people and ignores others. So what happens when the ignored people decide to write their own laws? Sam didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure there was one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, and another answered from miles away. The desert was alive at night, full of creatures that avoided the killing heat of day, emerging in shadow to hunt and live and die in their own ancient rhythms. "You think we'll make it to El Paso?" Sam asked eventually. "I think Taza wants us to," Mary replied. "I think he needs witnesses. People who will carry the story, spread the word. The hunters are dead, but the message needs to live. This land is not open for exploitation anymore. The Apache have drawn a line." She stood up, stretching. "Whether that line holds depends on what happens next. If more hunters come, more will die. If soldiers come, there'll be war. But if people listen, if they understand, maybe something different is possible." "You think people will listen?" Mary laughed, but it was a sad sound. No, I don't. We'll carry the message, but it'll be ignored by everyone who matters. Men in offices in Austin will read the report and send more soldiers. Plantation owners will hire more hunters, and the cycle will continue until either the Apache are destroyed or they kill enough people that it becomes too expensive to continue. She looked down at Sam. "But we'll try anyway, because that's what choosing means. Doing the right thing even when you know it probably won't work." She left him to his watch, disappearing back into the camp. Sam sat alone with his thoughts and his rifle and his growing understanding that the world was far more complicated than anyone had taught him. Good and evil, civilization and savagery, justice and revenge. All these neat categories were dissolving like morning mist, revealing something more complex and troubling underneath. The night wore on. Sam's watch ended, and another teamster replaced him. He crawled into his bedroll, but still couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the circle of bodies, the planted rifles, the empty chains. And he heard Taza's voice, "Choose which kind of human you will become." By dawn, they were moving again, following the canyon system toward Vasquez's trading post. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows that stretched ahead like fingers pointing the way. And somewhere in the mountains above, Sam knew Apache warriors were watching, waiting, protecting or threatening or simply witnessing. He couldn't tell which. And maybe it didn't matter. They were there, and they were not leaving, and the world would have to adjust to that reality. 2 days later, they reached the trading post, a rough collection of adobe buildings clustered around a well in a valley between two mesas. Hector Vasquez turned out to be a weathered Mexican man in his 60s, with sharp eyes and a quick smile. He welcomed them warmly, asked no questions about their journey, and offered fair prices for supplies. That night, over dinner in his trading post, Webb told him their story. Vasquez listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression giving nothing away. When Webb finished, the trader refilled everyone's coffee and spoke in careful, measured tones. "Taza is known to me," he said. "He trades here sometimes when his people need things they cannot make or find. He is honorable, intelligent, and absolutely uncompromising when it comes to protecting his people." Vasquez looked around the table. "What he did to those hunters, you will hear it called barbaric, murder, savagery. But I will tell you this. 3 years ago, those same hunters came through here trying to capture a group of runaway slaves hiding in the hills. I refused to help them, told them to leave. They threatened me, said they'd burn down my post." He smiled grimly. "That night, every one of their horses disappeared. They were found 2 days later, 10 miles south, tied to mesquite trees with their saddles arranged in neat piles. A message: we are watching, we are capable, and we are merciful. This time." "That was Taza?" Sam asked. "His warriors, yes. They could have killed those hunters then 3 years ago. Instead, they embarrassed them, sent them away on foot, gave them a chance to learn, to change." Vasquez's expression hardened. "They did not learn. They came back again and again, taking people who deserved freedom. So Taza stopped being merciful." "Will there be war?" Mary asked. Vasquez considered the question. "There is already war. It has been going on since Cortés landed in Mexico, since the first European decided that this continent belonged to him simply because he planted a flag. What you're asking is whether it will escalate, whether the killing will spread." He shrugged. "That depends on whether your people can learn what the hunters could not, that some things are worth more than profit, that some peoples will not be conquered or converted or convinced to disappear quietly into history." They stayed at Vasquez's trading post for 2 days, resting and resupplying. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they prepared to continue their journey, Sam noticed something carved into one of the fence posts near the well. Apache symbols he couldn't read, but next to them, in careful English letters, "Here is peace." He pointed it out to Vasquez. "What does it mean?" "It means this place is neutral ground. Apache can come here safely. Whites can come here safely. Mexicans, runaway slaves, traders, soldiers on leave, all are welcome. All are protected." Vasquez ran his hand over the carving. "Taza and I made this agreement 5 years ago. It is one of the few places left where different peoples can meet without violence." He looked at Sam. "The world needs more places like this, spaces where the guns stay holstered and the conversations happen, but such places are rare and getting rarer." As they loaded the wagons, a young Apache rider approached from the north, moving at speed. He pulled up at the edge of the trading post, spoke briefly with Vasquez in Apache, then rode off again. The trader's face remained neutral, but Sam saw something shift behind his eyes. "News?" Webb asked. "The army is coming," Vasquez said quietly. "A company of cavalry heading this way from Fort Davis. They heard about the hunters, and they're looking for someone to punish." He looked at Webb. "You should leave. Now. If they find you here, they'll ask questions, and your honest answers might make things worse." Webb didn't argue. They finished loading in record time and moved out, heading west toward El Paso. As they climbed out of the valley, Sam looked back one last time. Vasquez stood alone by his well, watching them go, and in the distance, Sam could see dust rising, the cavalry approaching fast. "Will he be all right?" Sam asked Mary, who rode beside him. "Vasquez, he's survived worse. The army knows his trading post is valuable. It's one of the few places they can buy information about Apache movements, negotiate prisoner exchanges, find guides. They won't touch him." She paused. "But they will ask questions, and depending on his answers, they might decide to push deeper into Apache territory. And then—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They traveled hard for the next 3 days, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was about to happen behind them. The terrain gradually changed from red rock canyons to rolling desert hills, then to the outskirts of true civilization, settlements, ranches, farms carved from the dust through sheer stubborn will. On the afternoon of the 4th day, they saw El Paso rising from the heat shimmer ahead, a collection of adobe buildings clustered along the Rio Grande, flags of 3 nations having flown over it at various times in its history. It looked like safety, like normalcy, like the world Sam had known before everything became complicated. But as they rolled into town, Sam realized he'd changed. The person who left San Antonio 2 weeks ago no longer existed. That person had believed in simple stories and clear morality. This new Sam understood that the world ran on power and consequence, that justice was something you made rather than something you received, and that choosing which kind of human to become was the most important decision he'd ever make. They unloaded at Mary's store, helped her inventory the supplies, and prepared to collect their pay. Webb gathered them together one last time before they parted ways. "Tomorrow, I'm going to the army post," he said. "I'll file a report about what we saw, deliver Tarza's message. They probably won't listen, but it needs to be said." He looked at each of them. "If any of you want to come with me, you're welcome. If you'd rather forget this whole trip and move on with your lives, I understand. No judgment either way." Crawford and the other Teamsters declined immediately, eager to return to familiar routines and safer routes. But Sam and Mary exchanged glances and nodded together. "We'll come," Sam said. "We're witnesses. We should witness." The next morning, 3 of them walked into Fort Bliss and asked to speak with the commanding officer. Colonel Marcus Reed was a career soldier with 30 years of frontier experience and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He listened to their story without interrupting, his expression unchanging. When Webb finished, Reed leaned back in his chair. "So you're telling me that a band of Apache warriors murdered 12 American citizens, and you want me to... what? Congratulate them?" "I want you to understand why it happened," Webb replied carefully. "Those weren't 12 innocent men. They were slave hunters operating illegally Illegally according to Apache law, maybe," Reed interrupted. "But Texas law is less clear. Those men had the right to pursue fugitive property across territorial boundaries. If they crossed some lines, that's a matter for courts, not execution." "Fugitive property," Mary repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "You mean human beings, escaped slaves, people seeking freedom." Reed's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to debate the morality of slavery, ma'am. I'm here to maintain order and protect American interests, and 12 dead citizens, regardless of their profession, is a threat to both." "So you'll send soldiers," Sam said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I'll do what I'm ordered to do," Reed replied, "and my orders are to demonstrate that American lives can't be taken without consequences, even on the frontier." He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "I appreciate you coming forward. Your testimony will be included in my report to Austin, but you should understand this isn't about justice or revenge or whatever noble motives you've decided those Apaches had. This is about power. Who has it, who keeps it, and what happens to those who challenge it?" They were dismissed. As they walked out of the fort, Sam felt sick to his stomach. He'd known intellectually that the army wouldn't care, but hearing it stated so boldly, so unapologetically, drove home the truth Tarza had already shown him. The law only worked for people the law considered worthy of protection. "What now?" he asked Webb. The caravan master shrugged wearily. "Now we go back to our lives. You'll find another job, I'll organize another caravan, Mary will run her store. The world keeps turning." He looked toward the mountains in the distance. "But somewhere out there, Tarza is preparing for what comes next. And when it does..." He shook his head. "I just hope there are survivors on both sides to tell the story correctly." They parted ways that afternoon. Mary returned to her store. Webb began organizing a smaller, safer caravan for his next run. And Sam found himself wandering El Paso's streets, watching people go about their normal lives, buying and selling and laughing and fighting and living as if the world wasn't balanced on the edge of something terrible. He walked down to the Rio Grande and sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. This river was a border, but what did that mean? The water didn't care about politics or treaties. It flowed according to gravity and geology, ancient forces that predated human claims of ownership. Nations rose and fell on its banks, but the river remained. Maybe that's what Taza understood, that the land itself was indifferent to human power struggles, that the earth would outlast all their wars and claims and violence. The Apache weren't fighting for ownership. They were fighting for the right to exist alongside everything else, to live according to their own ways without being hunted or confined or converted. And for that, they would be hunted down and destroyed by people who couldn't imagine a world where different peoples simply coexisted without one dominating the other. Sam made his decision then, sitting by that river with the sun setting behind him. He wouldn't go back to San Antonio. He wouldn't find another simple teamster job. Instead, he'd stay here, on the frontier, in the complicated places where different worlds collided. Maybe he couldn't stop what was coming. Maybe no one could. But he could at least bear witness. He could tell the story honestly, without the simplifications and lies that turned humans into heroes or villains. He could choose which kind of human to become. 3 weeks after they delivered their testimony at Fort Bliss, Sam was working at Mary's general store when the soldiers rode through El Paso. 2 full companies. Over 100 men armed with new rifles and enough ammunition to start a war. Colonel Reed led them personally, his face set like stone, eyes fixed on the mountains ahead. They didn't stop in town, didn't resupply or rest. They just rode through like a storm front, leaving dust and tension in their wake. "God help them," Mary whispered, watching from the store's window. "They have no idea what they're riding into." Sam thought of Taza, of those painted symbols on stone, of the warriors who could move silent as shadows through terrain they'd known for generations. "Should we warn them?" "We did warn them. They didn't listen." Mary turned away from the window. "Now we wait and see if anyone comes back with enough sense to tell the truth about what happens next." The waiting was worse than the journey had been. Days passed with no news, then weeks. El Paso buzzed with rumors. The Apache had been cornered and destroyed, or the soldiers had been massacred to a man, or both sides had suffered terrible losses. No one knew for certain, because no one came back to say. Then, on a hot afternoon in late summer, a lone rider staggered into town on a half-dead horse. He was young, maybe 20, wearing tattered remains of a cavalry uniform. His left arm was bound in a dirty bandage, and his eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that changed the geography of his soul. Sam helped him down from the horse and got him water, while Mary ran for the doctor. The soldier drank greedily, water spilling down his chin, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the canteen. "What happened?" Sam asked gently. "Where's the rest of your company?" The soldier's eyes focused on him slowly, as if pulling himself back from a great distance. "Dead. Most of them. We walked into hell." By evening, the story had spread through town. The soldier, his name was Thomas Wright from Pennsylvania, was coherent enough to give a fuller account. Sam and Mary sat with him in the back room of her store while he talked, his voice flat and mechanical, reciting horror like a multiplication table. "We tracked them for 8 days, Wright said, following signs that seemed clear. Campfire remains, horse tracks, marked trails. Colonel Reed was confident. He said Apache always ran when faced with superior numbers and firepower." Wright laughed, a broken sound. He was wrong. They weren't running. They were leading us. The trap had been elaborate and perfect. The cavalry had followed what seemed like an obvious trail into a narrow canyon system. The rear guard noticed the problem first. A rockslide had blocked their exit route, fresh enough that dust still hung in the air. Before they could react, before they could even properly form defensive positions, the shooting started. "They were above us," Wright continued, staring at nothing. "On the canyon walls, behind rocks, in crevices we didn't even know existed. They had rifles, good ones, probably taken from previous fights or traded for, and they knew how to use them." He touched his bandaged arm. "First volley took down 30 men in maybe 10 seconds. Just dropped them. Clean shots, professional. Then they disappeared, and we didn't see them again for hours. Colonel Reed had tried to organize a defense, but defending against an enemy you couldn't see was nearly impossible. Every time the soldiers tried to move, tried to scale the walls or retreat, more shots would ring out from different positions. The Apache didn't waste ammunition. Every bullet seemed to find a target. "They let us sit there all day," Wright said, "cooking in the sun, no water, watching our wounded die. Every few hours they'd shoot a couple more of us, just to remind us they were still there. By nightfall, we'd lost maybe 60 men without ever firing effectively back at them." The night had brought a different kind of terror. Wright described how drums had echoed through the canyon, slow, rhythmic, hypnotic. Some of the soldiers started praying loudly, others just sobbed. Colonel Reed tried to maintain discipline, but his voice lacked conviction now. They were trapped, and everyone knew it. Around midnight, someone started screaming. Wright's voice dropped to a whisper. "Jenkins, from my company. He'd been on sentry duty at the northern end of our position. We found him with his throat cut, his rifle gone. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anyone. The Apache had walked right through our lines, killed a man, and disappeared like smoke." After that, discipline collapsed. Men started deserting into the darkness, preferring to take their chances running than dying slowly in that killing ground. Most of them didn't make it far. Wright heard gunshots and screams echoing through the night. By dawn, maybe 40 soldiers remained alive, huddled together in the center of the canyon, surrounded by their dead. That's when Taza came down. Wright's eyes finally showed emotion, not fear, but something like awe. He just walked down the canyon wall completely exposed, carrying no weapons. Alone. We could have shot him 100 times, but Reed ordered us to hold fire. I think he knew we'd already lost. Taza had stood maybe 30 feet from the remaining soldiers and spoken in perfect English. Wright couldn't remember every word, but the essence was clear. You were warned. You ignored the warning. These men died because your leaders value pride over wisdom. He'd offered terms. The survivors could leave, keep their sidearms for protection against wild animals, and carry their wounded. But they would leave behind their rifles, their ammunition, and their certainty that Apache land was theirs to patrol. Reed refused, Wright said. Called Taza a savage, said Americans don't surrender to Indians, said he'd see Taza hanged before he'd accept terms. Wright's face contorted. That's when the shooting started again, but this time it was targeted. Reed went down first, single shot through the heart. Then the other officers, one by one, precise, deliberate, sending a message. After the officers were dead, Taza had repeated his offer. This time the surviving soldiers accepted. They'd left their rifles and ammunition in neat stacks, helped each other with the wounded, and walked out of that canyon under Apache escort. 23 men survived out of over 100. Wright was the first to make it back to civilization. He could have killed us all, Wright whispered. Every single one. We were beaten, disarmed, helpless, but he let us go. Made us promise to tell the truth about what happened. Made us promise to carry the message. He looked directly at Sam. No more hunters, no more patrols, no more pretending that land belongs to people who just showed up with guns and flags. The Apache are done asking permission to exist. Mary handed Wright more water and a plate of food. What will you do now? Desert, probably, Wright said it matter-of-factly. I joined the army to see the frontier, maybe make something of myself. I didn't sign up to hunt down people who just want to be left alone. What happened in that canyon, that wasn't war. That was execution. We were the criminals, and Taza was the law. He ate a few bites of bread. I'm going to California, maybe Oregon. Somewhere I can forget what I saw, what I was part of. Over the next few days, more survivors trickled into El Paso and other nearby settlements. They all told similar stories, stories that grew with each telling, but maintained a core of undeniable truth. The U.S. Army had ridden into Apache territory with overwhelming force and been completely destroyed by a smaller, smarter, more determined enemy fighting on their own ground. The official response from military command was predictable. They called it an ambush, treachery, savagery. They promised reinforcements, better tactics, eventual victory. But Sam noticed something interesting. No new cavalry units headed into Apache territory. No colonels volunteered to succeed Reed. The rhetoric continued, but the actual military action stopped cold. "They're afraid," Mary observed one evening, closing up the store. Really, truly afraid. Maybe for the first time they understand they can't just roll over everyone with numbers and firepower. The Apache taught them a lesson, and enough soldiers survived to spread it around. Sam had taken a permanent job at Mary's store, helping with inventory, dealing with suppliers, talking to customers. He'd also started writing long letters to newspapers back east, articles for territorial publications, anything to get the truth out. He wrote about the slave hunters, about Taza's sister, about the choice between justice and revenge. Most editors rejected his work as too sympathetic to hostiles, but a few published it, and slowly, imperceptibly, the narrative began to shift. Not everyone in El Paso was happy about the shift. 3 months after the Canyon massacre, Sam was loading supplies into the storeroom when 3 men confronted him in the alley. They were rough-looking, the kind of frontier hard cases who made their living in the grey areas between legal and criminal. "You're that writer," one of them said. "The one telling everyone the Apache are heroes." Sam kept his hands visible and his voice calm. "I'm telling what happened. If that makes them look heroic and the army look foolish, maybe the army should make different choices." "You're making it hard for honest men to make a living," another growled. He had a scar running down his face and eyes like chips of flint. "Some of us hunt fugitives for bounties, legal work. But your articles got people questioning whether they should help us, whether they should report sightings. You're killing our business." "You mean killing your ability to kidnap people and sell them to plantations?" The scarred man's hand moved toward his belt, where a knife handle protruded. "You got a smart mouth for someone standing alone in an alley." "He's not alone." Mary stepped into view from the back door of her store, holding a shotgun casually but pointed in their general direction. "And I'm a terrible shot when I'm nervous. Real unpredictable. Could hit anyone." She smiled sweetly. "You boys want to test my nerves?" The 3 men measured their options, and apparently didn't like the odds. They backed off, muttering threats that everyone pretended to take seriously. But Sam knew it wasn't over. He'd made enemies of people who lived by violence, and eventually they'd find him without Mary around to intervene. That night he wrote a letter to his parents in San Antonio. He didn't tell them about the confrontation in the alley, but he did try to explain what he'd learned, what he'd seen. "The world isn't simple," he wrote. "Good and evil aren't teams you can join. Every day we choose, through our actions and inactions, which kind of world we're building. I choose to build one where people can tell the truth without fear, where justice matters more than profit, where different peoples can coexist without one needing to dominate the others." He knew his parents wouldn't understand. They were good people, church-going and honest, but they'd never questioned the basic structure of their society. They believed in progress, civilization, the inevitable spread of American values across the continent. They couldn't imagine those values might look different from the other side, might appear as threats rather than gifts. But Sam had to try. If he could convince even one person to question their assumptions, to see beyond the simple narratives, maybe it was worth the attempt. The letter remained unanswered. Winter came to the borderlands, bringing cold winds down from the mountains and brief, violent rainstorms that turned the desert temporarily green. Trade slowed as people stayed close to home, avoiding the weather and the renewed tension. There'd been no more military expeditions into Apache territory, but there'd also been no peace agreement. Both sides watched each other warily, waiting to see who would move next. Sam used the slow season to organize his writings into something more substantial, a book maybe, or at least a comprehensive account of everything he'd witnessed. He interviewed other survivors from the Canyon massacre, talked to traders who'd dealt with the Apache, even convinced Hector Vasquez to ride up from his trading post and share stories. "Taza is a complicated man," Vasquez told him over coffee in Mary's store. "He believes in peace, truly believes it's possible, but he also understands that peace requires strength. If you're too weak to defend yourself, people don't make peace with you. They just take what they want. So he fights to create space for peace." The old trader smiled sadly. "It's a paradox that would break most men. But Taza is not most men." "Have you seen him recently?" Sam asked. 2 weeks ago, he came to trade for supplies. Coffee, sugar, metal tools. We talked for a while. He knows about your writing, by the way." Sam's heart rate quickened. "What did he say?" "He said you're doing dangerous work, making enemies of dangerous people. He said those enemies will probably try to silence you eventually." Vasquez paused. "He also said that if you're ever in trouble, if you need a place where the laws of Texas don't reach, his people will remember that you told the truth when others chose lies." The offer was unexpected and deeply moving. Tell him I appreciate it, but I need to stay here, keep writing, keep trying to change minds." "He knows." Vasquez stood up to leave. "He also knows you'll probably fail. Most prophets do, but someone has to try, and he respects that you're willing to be that someone." After Vasquez left, Sam sat alone in the darkened store, thinking about prophecy and failure and the weight of choosing principles over safety. He was 20 years old and already exhausted by the enormity of the world's injustices. How did people like Taza keep fighting when victory seemed impossible? How did Mary maintain her store and her dignity in a world that constantly tried to diminish both? The answer, he decided, was that they didn't fight for victory. They fought for integrity, the basic human need to live in alignment with your values, regardless of the outcome. Winning would be nice, but the real battle was internal, maintaining your humanity in the face of inhumanity, refusing to become what you opposed even when it would be easier. Spring arrived, and with it, unexpected news. The Texas legislature had passed a new law restricting the operation of slave hunters in Western territories. It wasn't a complete ban that would have been politically impossible, but it required proper documentation, prohibited the capture of free blacks or Indians, and established penalties for violations. It was a small victory, barely a footnote in history, but it was something. "You did that," Mary said when she showed Sam the newspaper article announcing the law. "Your articles, your testimony, your stubborn refusal to let the story die, it added up." Sam wasn't so sure. "It's just one law. It doesn't bring back Taza's sister's laughter. It doesn't resurrect the dozen men killed in that canyon, or the 80 soldiers who died because their colonel was too proud to listen to warnings." "No," Mary agreed, "but it might stop the next dozen from being killed. It might save the next sister. Progress isn't about fixing everything. It's about making tomorrow slightly less terrible than today." She smiled. "That's worth celebrating." They celebrated modestly, a good dinner, a bottle of wine Mary had been saving, a quiet evening, talking about futures that might actually include something other than violence and grief. Sam allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. Maybe the work was making a difference. Maybe telling the truth mattered after all. The attack came 3 days later. Sam was walking back to his boarding house after closing the store when 3 men stepped out of the shadows. He recognized one from the alley confrontation months earlier, the one with the scar. They didn't waste time with conversation. The scarred man simply pulled a knife and moved forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Sam ran. He wasn't a fighter, wasn't armed, wasn't prepared for violence. He just ran, boots pounding on the dirt street, lungs burning, heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he heard his pursuers giving chase, their voices mixing with his ragged breathing and the sound of his own fear. He made it 2 blocks before someone grabbed his collar and yanked him backward. He fell hard, dust exploding around him, stars blooming in his vision as his head hit the ground. The scarred man loomed over him, knife gleaming in the moonlight. "Should have kept your mouth shut," the man said. "Should have stuck to selling flour and keeping ledgers. But you had to be noble, had to take the side of savages against your own people." Sam tried to speak, but couldn't find his voice. This was it then. Dying in a dusty street for articles that maybe 500 people had read, for a truth that would be forgotten in a week. Not a heroic end, just a stupid one. The knife descended and stopped. The scarred man's eyes went wide. He looked down at his chest, where an arrow had appeared as if by magic, its point protruding from just below his collarbone. He opened his mouth, closed it, then fell sideways into the dust. The other 2 attackers spun around, drawing pistols, looking for targets. They found them, 3 Apache warriors standing on nearby rooftops, bows drawn, silhouetted against the moon. The moment stretched out, taut as a bowstring. Then one of the attackers made a choice, raised his pistol, and was dead before he could pull the trigger, an arrow through his throat. The 3rd man was smarter or more cowardly. He dropped his pistol, raised his hands, and backed away slowly. The warriors let him go. Then they descended from the rooftops like shadows, moving with liquid grace, and approached Sam where he lay gasping in the dust. The lead warrior knelt beside him. He was young, maybe Sam's age, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd been trained in multiple traditions. He spoke in accented but clear English. "Taza sent us. He said you might need protection." He looked at the 2 bodies. He was right. Sam struggled to sit up. "How long have you been watching?" 3 days. Since the men who wanted you dead were spotted entering El Paso." The warrior helped Sam to his feet. "Taza keeps his promises. You told the truth about his war, about his reasons. He promised to remember. This is remembering." By morning, the story would be all over El Paso. Apache warriors entering town, killing 2 white men, and disappearing like smoke. Some would call it an outrage, an invasion. Others would quietly understand that justice had been served, that men who hunted in the dark had been hunted in return. Sam never saw the warriors again after that night. But sometimes, when he walked the streets after sunset, he felt watched in a way that was protective rather than threatening, and he understood that Taza's reach extended further than anyone suspected, that the war chief was playing a longer, more subtle game than simple revenge. The incident in El Paso changed everything and nothing. 2 men were dead, known associates of the slave-hunting trade, men with warrants in 3 territories for various crimes. The law investigated half-heartedly and concluded it was likely a dispute among criminals that happened to involve Apache methods. No charges were filed. No army units were dispatched. The system had decided, quietly and pragmatically, that some deaths weren't worth avenging. But the message was clear to everyone who mattered. The Apache could strike anywhere, any time, at targets of their choosing. The invisible barrier that had protected El Paso and other settlements, the assumption that civilized towns were off-limits to savage reprisals, had been shattered. Nowhere was safe if you made yourself an enemy of Taza and his people. Sam continued writing, but with renewed urgency. He'd been given a gift, his life, his voice, his ability to continue bearing witness, and he wouldn't waste it. His articles grew more pointed, more detailed, more willing to name names and call out injustice wherever he found it. Newspapers that had previously rejected his work now published it eagerly, sensing that the frontier narrative was shifting and Sam was helping write the new version. 6 months after the attempt on his life, a letter arrived from Austin. It was written on official stationery from the Texas Historical Society and signed by a professor named Dr. Elizabeth Monroe. She'd been collecting accounts of frontier life for a comprehensive history and had read Sam's articles. Would he be willing to contribute a more detailed narrative? The society would pay, of course, and his work would be preserved as part of the permanent record. Sam brought the letter to Mary, who read it twice before speaking. "This is significant. The Historical Society is as official as it gets. They have connections to the governor, to Congress, to people who shape policy. If they're interested in your story, it means the narrative is really changing. Or they want to control it," Sam countered. "Put my writing in some archive where it's technically preserved but never actually read, possibly. Or maybe Dr. Monroe is genuinely interested in the truth." Mary handed back the letter. "You won't know unless you respond. And even if it is an attempt to bury your work, at least it'll be buried in an official archive. Sometimes the truth survives in unexpected places," Sam wrote back, agreeing to contribute a full account. Over the next 3 months, he compiled everything: his original testimony about finding the hunters' bodies, his encounter with Taza in the canyon, Wright's story of the massacre, his own attack and rescue. He wrote about the complexities of frontier justice, the economics of slavery that drove the hunting trade, the impossible position of the Apache caught between extinction and resistance. The document grew to nearly 100 pages. When he finally sent it to Dr. Monroe, he felt both relief and anxiety. This was his complete testimony, everything he'd witnessed and understood. It could change minds or be dismissed as the ramblings of an Apache sympathizer. He'd done his part. Now the world would decide what to do with it. While he waited for a response, life continued. Mary's store prospered as more settlers arrived in El Paso, bringing their needs for supplies and their hunger for news from the frontier. Sam hired additional help and found himself becoming something like a manager, though the title felt too grand for someone who mostly restocked shelves and balanced ledgers. He also started teaching. Some of the Mexican children in El Paso wanted to learn English, and Sam began holding informal classes in the back room of the store after hours. It was rewarding work, watching young minds grapple with new sounds and meanings, seeing their faces light up when understanding clicked into place. One of his best students was a girl named Rosa, maybe 12 years old, who had fled north from Chihuahua with her family after raiders destroyed their village. "Why do white people hate Indians so much?" Rosa asked him one evening after class. The question was sudden and direct, the way children's questions often were. "My abuela says we have Indian blood. Tarahumara from the mountains. Does that mean white people hate us too?" Sam considered his answer carefully. "I don't think it's hate, exactly. I think it's fear and greed. The Apache have land that other people want. They have a way of life that doesn't fit into the system being built. So instead of finding a way to coexist, some people decided it would be easier to just remove them." He paused. "As for your Indian blood, anyone who hates you for that isn't worth worrying about. You're Rosa. That's all that matters." She seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least willing to move on. But the question stayed with Sam long after class ended. How did you explain centuries of colonial violence to a child? How did you describe a worldview that saw some humans as obstacles to be cleared rather than people to be encountered? Dr. Monroe's response arrived in late summer. She'd read his entire account and found it remarkably even-handed, given your obvious sympathies. The Historical Society wanted to publish it as part of a larger volume on Texas frontier history. They'd pay him a modest sum, would include his name as a credited author, and would distribute the book to libraries and schools throughout the state. There was a catch, of course. The Society wanted him to add a concluding chapter, something that looked toward the future, that discussed possible solutions to the Apache problem. They understood his position, Dr. Monroe wrote, but the book needed to offer hope, to suggest that peaceful coexistence might be possible with the right policies and attitudes. Sam spent a week wrestling with that request. How did you write a hopeful ending to a story that wasn't over and might not end well? How did you suggest solutions when the fundamental problem was that one group wanted land and resources while another group already lived there and refused to leave? Any solution that didn't involve genuine respect for Apache sovereignty wasn't really a solution. It was just a slower form of conquest. In the end, he wrote honestly. He described Vasquez's trading post as a model for peaceful coexistence. He detailed the new laws restricting slave hunters as a step toward justice. He quoted Taza's words about the world having space for many peoples and many ways of living. But he also made clear that peace required more than good intentions. It required powerful people accepting limits on their power, wealthy people accepting limits on their wealth, and society accepting that progress didn't always mean expansion. "Some will call this naive," he wrote in his conclusion. "They'll say the Apache must eventually adapt to American civilization or be destroyed by it. But I have met Apache warriors and American soldiers, Apache leaders and American politicians. I have seen wisdom and foolishness on both sides, courage and cruelty in equal measure. The question isn't which culture is superior, it's whether we're mature enough as a species to let different cultures exist side by side, learning from each other rather than trying to dominate each other. I don't know if we're capable of that kind of maturity, but I know we should try." Dr. Munro accepted the chapter with minor edits. The book was published in December 1842, 2 years after Sam had first seen those scalped bodies in the desert. It wasn't a bestseller. Frontier history wasn't popular reading material in Texas, where people were more interested in making history than studying it. But it sold respectably. And more importantly, it was read by people who mattered: legislators, military officers, journalists, educators. Sam received letters from readers. Some were supportive, praising his courage in telling an unpopular truth. Others were hostile, accusing him of betraying his race and his civilization. One particularly vitriolic letter accused him of being secretly Apache himself, perhaps captured as a child and raised by savages, which would explain his twisted loyalties. He kept all the letters, both positive and negative. They were evidence that the story was reaching people, making them react, forcing them to confront questions they'd prefer to avoid. That was worth more than universal approval. In the spring of 1843, unexpected visitors arrived at Mary's store. A delegation of Quakers from Pennsylvania, part of a group calling themselves the Society of Friends Indian Committee. They'd read Sam's book and were touring the frontier to better understand the conflicts between settlers and native peoples. Could Sam spare time to talk with them? He met them in Mary's store after hours, 5 Quakers, men and women both, dressed simply and speaking with quiet intensity. Their leader was a woman named Grace Hutchinson, probably in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "We've been reading accounts of frontier violence for years," she told Sam. "Most of them are propaganda, either painting Indians as demonic savages or as noble innocents. Your writing is different. You present people as people, complicated and contradictory. That's rare and valuable." "I just wrote what I saw," Sam replied. "No." Grace's correction was gentle but firm. "You wrote what you saw and what it meant. You provided context, history, motivation. Most writers just describe events and let readers draw whatever conclusions their prejudices suggest. You challenge those prejudices directly." She leaned forward. "We want to do something similar, but on a larger scale. We're planning a comprehensive study of Indian relations across the entire frontier, not just Texas, but New Mexico, Arizona, Indian Territory. We want to document treaties broken, promises unkept, violence on all sides, and we want to propose actual solutions, policies that might lead to genuine peace." "That's ambitious," Mary observed from behind the counter where she'd been listening quietly. "Also dangerous. You'll make powerful enemies." "We're Quakers," Grace said with a slight smile. "We're comfortable with powerful enemies. The question is whether Sam would be willing to help. We need someone with first-hand experience, someone the Apache trust enough to talk to, someone who can write clearly about complex situations." Sam looked at Mary, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This was an opportunity, maybe the best one he'd ever get to make a real difference, but it was also a commitment, months of travel through dangerous territory, confronting violence and injustice everywhere he went, putting his safety at risk for what might ultimately be an impossible goal. "I'll do it," he said, "but I have conditions. I write the truth as I see it, even if it contradicts what your society wants to hear. I won't soften violence or make excuses for anyone. And if we're going to talk to the Apache, we do it with respect. We're asking to enter their world, not demanding they explain themselves to us." Grace smiled, this time with genuine warmth. "Those aren't conditions, Sam. Those are exactly the principles we're hoping to follow." She extended her hand. "Welcome to the committee." The next 6 months were among the most intense of Sam's life. The Quaker delegation traveled throughout the Texas frontier, visiting settlements and trading posts, interviewing settlers and soldiers, and, most remarkably, meeting with Apache leaders who agreed to talk with these strange white people who carried no weapons and spoke of peace. Sam served as guide and translator, using the contacts he'd developed through Vasquez and his writing. It was delicate work. The Apache were understandably suspicious of any white delegation, even Quakers. Too many promises had been broken, too many treaties violated. But slowly, through patience and persistence, conversations began. In a canyon north of El Paso, Sam sat with Taza again. The war chief had aged in the 3 years since their first meeting, new scars on his face, new weight in his eyes. But he still carried himself with that same absolute confidence, the bearing of someone who'd looked death in the face so many times it no longer impressed him. Grace Hutchinson sat across from him, with Sam translating when needed. "We want to understand what peace would look like from your perspective," she said directly. "Not peace as surrender, but genuine coexistence. What would that require?" Taza considered the question for a long moment before answering. "First, recognition that we exist, not as obstacles to be cleared or children to be educated, but as a people with our own ways, our own laws, our own right to this land. Second, define territory that is truly ours, not a temporary concession that will be broken when gold is discovered or settlers get ambitious. Third, the end of the hunting trade. No more stealing our people to sell them. No more treating human beings as property." He looked directly at Grace. "Can your people agree to these things?" "Some of us can," Grace replied honestly. "Many cannot. The people in power. They see the frontier as empty space, waiting to be filled with farms and towns and progress. They don't understand that it's already full of life, just different kinds of life than they're used to. Then there will be more war," Taza said simply. "My warriors are tired. I am tired. We have lost too many, sacrificed too much. But we will not disappear to make room for your farms. We will fight until we win, or until the last of us dies fighting. Those are the only choices your people have left us." Sam translated the exchange faithfully, watching Grace's face. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't try to soften the reality. She just nodded and made notes in her journal, preserving Taza's words for whatever report the committee would eventually produce. Later, as they rode back toward El Paso, Grace spoke quietly to Sam. "He's right, you know, about the choices. The question is whether enough people in power can understand that before it's too late. My fear is they won't. My hope is that by documenting these conversations we create a record that future generations can use to understand what was lost and why." "Future generations," Sam repeated. "So you're not expecting change in our lifetimes?" "I'm expecting small changes. Individual minds shifted. Occasional policy improvements, moments of clarity amid the general chaos." Grace looked at the desert stretching around them. "But real change, the kind that lets different peoples truly coexist, that takes generations. We're planting seeds. Maybe they'll grow, maybe they won't, but someone has to plant them." The committee's work continued through fall and into winter. They documented dozens of broken treaties, hundreds of violent incidents, countless examples of the gap between official policy and actual practice. They also found unexpected moments of hope, trading posts like Vasquez's where genuine friendships crossed cultural lines, mixed families where Apache and Mexican and Anglo bloodlines mingled, soldiers who'd come to respect their supposed enemies and refused to participate in punitive expeditions. Sam wrote constantly, his notebooks filling with observations and interviews and reflections. He was 23 years old and felt ancient, weighed down by the accumulated sorrows of a frontier that chewed up lives and spit out statistics. But he kept writing, because that's what witnesses did. They recorded, preserved, testified. Someone had to remember honestly, without the distortions of victory or the bitterness of defeat. In January 1844, the committee returned to Pennsylvania to compile their findings into a formal report. Sam returned to El Paso, exhausted but satisfied he'd done important work. Mary welcomed him back with a feast and a torrent of local news he'd missed during his travels. "Oh, and you got a letter," she said, handing him an envelope. "From the War Department in Washington. Looks official." Sam opened it with trembling hands. The letter was brief and formal. The Secretary of War had read his book and the preliminary reports from the Quaker Committee. The department was establishing a new Office of Indian Affairs and wanted to hire people with genuine frontier experience and cultural understanding. Would Sam be interested in a position as a field agent, helping to mediate disputes and advise on policy? It was a dream job and a nightmare combined, a chance to influence policy from inside the system, but also a risk of being corrupted by that system, of having his honest observations twisted into justifications for whatever the government wanted to do anyway. "What do you think?" he asked Mary. She read the letter carefully before responding. "I think it's an opportunity. Also, a trap. Also maybe the best chance you'll get to actually make a difference, instead of just writing about how things should be different." She handed it back. "The question is whether you trust yourself to work inside the system without becoming part of what's wrong with it." Sam thought about Taza, about the hunters' bodies in the desert, about Thomas Wright's broken voice describing the Canyon Massacre. He thought about Rosa asking why people hated Indians, about Vasquez maintaining his neutral trading post against all odds, about Grace Hutchinson planting seeds for future generations. "I'll take the job," he said, "but I'll do it on my terms. I'll tell the truth in every report. I'll push for actual justice, and the moment they try to make me lie or compromise what I know is right, I'll resign and write about why. Deal?" Mary smiled. "Deal. Though I'll miss having you around the store. You're decent at inventory management. You'll manage. You managed before I showed up. You'll manage after I leave." Sam looked around the store that had been his home for nearly 4 years. "But I'll visit, and I'll keep writing. No matter where I end up or what job I'm doing, I'll keep documenting the truth. That's the one thing I can control." He wrote his acceptance letter that night, then spent his last weeks in El Paso preparing for the transition. He trained his replacement at the store, said goodbye to Rosa and his other students, and made one final trip to Vasquez's trading post to leave a letter for Taza. The letter was simple. "I'm going to work for the government. I don't know if I can change anything, but I'm going to try. If I fail, if I become part of the problem, I hope you'll remember that I at least attempted to be part of the solution. Thank you for showing me that the world is more complicated than simple stories suggest, and that justice is worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible. Vasquez promised to deliver it. Taza will understand," the old trader said. "He knows that some fights happen with guns and some happen with words and policies. Both matter. Both require courage." He gripped Sam's shoulder. "Go. Do your work. And remember, the border between good and evil runs through every human heart, not between peoples or nations. Keep your heart on the right side." In March 1844, Sam boarded a stage heading east. He watched El Paso disappear behind him, the desert stretching endless and ancient and utterly indifferent to human drama. Somewhere out there, Taza and his warriors were living, fighting, surviving. Somewhere, the slave hunters who remained were adapting to new laws and finding new ways to profit from misery. Somewhere, soldiers were training for the next expedition, and Apache children were learning to shoot, and settlers were building homes on land they didn't own, and traders were facilitating exchanges that crossed every boundary humans had invented. The world kept turning, and Sam was just one person trying to nudge it in a slightly better direction. Probably he would fail. Probably the forces of expansion and conquest were too powerful to stop or even slow, but maybe, just maybe, his testimony would survive. A voice from the frontier saying that different futures had been possible, that choices had been made, and that history didn't have to be inevitable. Washington, D.C. in 1844 was a swamp, literally and metaphorically. The city was built on drained wetlands that still flooded every spring, and the political atmosphere was equally soggy with corruption, compromise, and competing interests. Sam arrived in April, carrying one trunk of belongings and several notebooks full of observations that would probably get him fired within a month. The Office of Indian Affairs was housed in a cramped building near the War Department, staffed by a dozen men who seemed permanently exhausted by the impossible task of mediating between indigenous peoples who wanted to be left alone and an expanding nation that couldn't stop itself from expanding. Sam's supervisor was a career bureaucrat named Robert Harrison, balding, overweight, and possessed of a cynicism so deep it had calcified into a kind of dark wisdom. "You're the frontier expert," Harrison said during Sam's first day, not looking up from the mountain of paperwork on his desk. "The one who writes sympathetically about Apaches and thinks we can all just get along if we try hard enough. I think we could avoid unnecessary violence if we honored our treaties and stopped stealing people," Sam corrected. Harrison finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "So you're an idealist. Good. We need idealists. They make the rest of us look practical by comparison." He gestured to a chair buried under stacks of reports. "Move those somewhere and sit down. I'm going to explain how things actually work here, and you're going to listen without interrupting, because if you interrupt me with your frontier wisdom, I will assign you to reviewing treaty disputes from 1790 for the next 6 months." Sam sat. Harrison talked for 2 hours, laying out the brutal realities of federal Indian policy. Treaties were written to be broken, signed by chiefs who often didn't represent their entire people, ratified by a Senate that had no intention of enforcing them, violated by settlers and traders with the implicit blessing of local authorities. The Office of Indian Affairs existed primarily to provide legal cover for expansion, to create paperwork that made conquest look like diplomacy. "So why do any of this?" Sam asked when Harrison finally paused. "If it's all a sham, why maintain the pretense? Because pretense matters." Harrison's voice was flat. "The sham today might become real tomorrow. The treaty we sign cynically now might be cited seriously in 50 years by someone who actually believes in it. We're not changing the world, Sam. We're creating raw material that future generations can use to build something better, or at least something less terrible." He pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer and poured 2 glasses without asking. "Welcome to government service. It's exactly as soul-crushing as you imagined, with the small consolation that occasionally, very occasionally, you get to stop something actively evil from happening. That's the job. That's all the job is." Over the following months, Sam learned that Harrison was right. Most of his work involved reviewing land claims, investigating treaty violations, and writing reports that would be read by exactly 3 people before being filed away forever. It was tedious, frustrating, and seemingly pointless. But then there were the exceptions, the cases where his involvement actually mattered. a dispute between Cherokee farmers and white settlers in Tennessee that Sam helped mediate by finding precedent in an old treaty. A proposed policy to forcibly relocate a band of Seminoles that Sam blocked by documenting that their land had been guaranteed in perpetuity, which prompted his first official reprimand for exceeding his authority. A smuggling operation selling arms to frontier tribes that Sam exposed, not because he opposed Indians having weapons, but because the smugglers were cheating everyone and destabilizing the entire region. He also continued writing, though now his audience was policymakers rather than the general public. He wrote memo after memo proposing sensible reforms, enforce existing treaties before negotiating new ones, prosecute settlers who trespassed on Indian land with the same vigor as Indians who defended it, establish truly neutral trading posts modeled on Vasquez's operation, create a system of indigenous governance that didn't require complete assimilation to American culture. Most of his proposals were ignored. Some were actively opposed by more senior officials who felt he was naive, or worse, secretly working against American interests. But a few found support from surprising quarters: congressmen who tired of endless frontier wars, military officers who respected worthy opponents, missionaries who'd actually lived among native peoples and understood them as humans rather than souls to be saved. In his second year in Washington, Sam testified before a Senate committee investigating frontier violence. He brought his notes from the Quaker expedition, his interviews with Taza and other Apache leaders, his documentation of the slave hunting trade. He spoke for 3 hours, laying out the economics and ethics of the conflict in terms even politicians could understand. "The question before you," he concluded, "is whether the United States is a nation of laws or a nation of power. If laws, then we must enforce our treaties and prosecute those who violate them, regardless of whose interests are served. If power, then we should be honest about it. Stop pretending we believe in justice or honor or any other principle beyond taking what we want. But we cannot claim to be both. We cannot write treaties promising peace and then look away when our citizens break those treaties. That's not policy. That's cowardice dressed up as pragmatism." The committee thanked him for his testimony and did absolutely nothing, but the speech was printed in several newspapers, and Sam received letters from readers, including one from Grace Hutchinson, who wrote, "You are still planting seeds. Some of them will grow in places you'll never see, in times you won't live to witness. That is the nature of prophetic work. Keep planting." He also received hate mail, including death threats from people who viewed him as a traitor to his race. The threats became serious enough that Harrison assigned him a security detail for several weeks, though Harrison made clear this was more about protecting the office's reputation than Sam's actual safety. "If you get killed, the newspapers will write that we couldn't even protect our own employees," Harrison explained. "Bad optics, but if you survive, you become another boring bureaucrat and people forget about you. Much better outcome." The security detail lasted a month before being quietly withdrawn. Sam went back to living in his small boarding house near the Capitol, walking to work each morning past monuments to men who'd founded a nation on the principle that all men were created equal, while personally owning human beings. The contradiction was so blatant it almost became invisible through sheer familiarity. In early 1846, rumors began circulating about war with Mexico. Tensions had been building for years over Texas and the disputed territories beyond. Sam read the intelligence reports, crossing his desk with growing horror. This wasn't about defense or justice. It was naked expansion, manifest destiny made military policy. He wrote a memo arguing that war with Mexico would destabilize the entire frontier, that fighting on two fronts against Mexico and various indigenous nations was strategically insane, that the financial cost would be enormous and the moral cost even higher. The memo was returned to him with a note from Harrison. "Good analysis, completely irrelevant." The decision has already been made by people who don't read memos from junior analysts. File this under "I told you so" and move on. The Mexican-American War began in May 1846. Sam watched from Washington as the conflict unfolded exactly as he'd predicted. Initial military success, followed by years of guerrilla warfare, massive expenditure of money and lives, destabilization of every treaty and relationship on the southern frontier. The Apache, Comanche, and other tribes took advantage of the chaos to reclaim territory, raid supply lines, and generally demonstrate that conquest was more expensive than coexistence. Taza, Sam learned through Vasquez's letters, had become a legendary figure during the war. He'd played both sides brilliantly, helping Mexican forces when it served Apache interests, raiding American supply lines when that made more sense, and always maintaining enough power to negotiate from strength. By war's end in 1848, the Apache controlled more territory than they had in decades, and both the American and Mexican governments were paying them to not attack settlements and trade routes. "He learned from us," Harrison observed when Sam shared this information. "He saw how we use treaties as weapons, how we negotiate in bad faith, how we play sides against each other, and he got better at it than we are. That's the real lesson here. We're teaching our enemies how to beat us, and then acting surprised when they succeed." The war ended with America gaining vast new territories in the Southwest, land that was, inconveniently, still inhabited by the people who'd been living there for centuries. Sam was assigned to a new project, developing policies for integrating these populations into American governance. The language was careful, bureaucratic, but the reality was clear. Figure out how to remove or control the Indians and Mexicans who now found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. Sam spent months in the Southwest during 1848 and 1849, traveling to the territories acquired from Mexico and talking to everyone he could find. He met Apache leaders who'd fought on both sides of the war, Mexican settlers trying to maintain their land claims under new laws, American soldiers tasked with enforcing a peace they didn't understand. And in a canyon near El Paso, he met Taza again. The war chief looked older now, pushing 50, his hair showing gray, his face marked by years of sun and conflict. But his eyes still held that absolute confidence, that certainty that came from surviving what should have killed you many times over. They sat by a small fire as the sun set, speaking through a mixture of English, Spanish, and Apache that Vasquez helped facilitate. Sam explained his position in the government, his attempts to influence policy, his frustrations with a system that seemed designed to prevent sensible outcomes. "You are a good man trying to make a bad system work," Taza said after listening to Sam's explanations. "That is admirable and futile. The system you serve exists to take land from people who have it and give it to people who want it. You cannot reform that from inside. You can only witness it and hope someone, someday, reads your witness and chooses differently." "So what would you have me do?" Sam asked. "Quit? Stop trying?" "No. Keep trying. Keep writing. Keep being the voice that says there was another way." Taza poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "But understand that you will probably lose. We are all probably going to lose. The wave that is coming, your settlers, your railroads, your hunger for land, it will not stop until it has covered everything. My people will resist, but resistance alone is not enough when the other side has infinite resources and infinite patience. Then why keep fighting?" Taza smiled, the expression sad but genuine. "Because it's who we are, because our children are watching and they need to see that we did not surrender, did not accept defeat as inevitable. Because maybe, somewhere in the future, someone will read your writings and my stories and understand that we tried, that different paths existed, that history could have been different." He looked directly at Sam. "You and I are not so different. You write policies that will be ignored. I fight battles I cannot win. But we do it anyway because the alternative is accepting that power makes right, that violence makes morality, that the strong can do what they want to the weak without consequence." They talked late into the night. Two men from different worlds united by a shared understanding that the world was broken and neither of them knew how to fix it. As Sam prepared to leave the next morning, Taza gave him a gift, a leather bag containing several items, an arrowhead from the battle where his sister had been recovered, a stone from the canyon where Colonel Reed's soldiers had been destroyed, and a small notebook written in a mixture of Apache and Spanish. "My sister wrote this," Taza explained, "after she returned to us, after she began remembering who she was. It's her story, what the hunters did to her, what the plantation was like, how she survived. I want you to have it, translate it, preserve it, make sure her voice is heard." His jaw tightened. They tried to erase her. They took her name, her language, her identity. But she wrote it down, she remembered. And now you will help make sure no one forgets. Sam accepted the notebook with trembling hands, understanding the weight of what he'd been given. This wasn't just a historical document, it was a human soul preserved in ink, a testimony that names and voices mattered even when systems tried to destroy them. "I'll translate it," Sam promised, "and I'll make sure it reaches people who need to read it. I swear." "I know you will, that's why I give it to you." Taza gripped Sam's shoulder in the Apache way, a gesture of respect between equals. "Go now. Do your work. Plant your seeds. And when the stories of this time are told, make sure some of them are true." Sam returned to Washington with the notebook and a renewed sense of purpose. He spent every evening for months translating Denahe's story, working with an Apache-speaking translator to capture not just the words, but the meaning, the emotion, the humanity behind them. Her story was devastating. The kidnapping, the long journey east in chains, the auction block where she was sold to a cotton plantation, the systematic attempt to break her spirit and remake her into something useful to her owners. But it was also a story of survival, of maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty, of small acts of resistance that preserved her sense of self even when everything else was stripped away. Sam published the translation in 1850 as a small book titled Denahe, A Story of Capture and Survival. It sold modestly but reached the right people. Abolitionists who used it as evidence that the slave system wasn't just immoral, but actively destroyed human beings. Humanitarians who saw it as proof that Indians were people deserving of the same rights as anyone else. Policymakers who couldn't ignore the specificity of her testimony. It also earned Sam his second official reprimand from the Office of Indian Affairs. Apparently, publishing the first-person account of an Apache woman criticizing American policies was inappropriate use of position for political purposes. Harrison delivered the reprimand with a barely concealed smile and a whispered, "Well done." By 1852, Sam had been working in Washington for 8 years. He was 30 years old and felt 100, ground down by the slow violence of bureaucracy, the endless compromise, the knowledge that every small victory was surrounded by countless defeats. But he kept working because he didn't know what else to do, because walking away felt like surrender. That spring, Congress debated a new policy for Southwest Territories. The proposal was comprehensive and brutal. Forced relocation of Apache bands to designated reservations, criminalization of traditional nomadic practices, authorization of military force against any resistance. It was cultural genocide, wrapped in the language of civilization and progress. Sam wrote his strongest memo yet, laying out every reason the policy would fail practically and morally. He cited precedents, referenced treaties, quoted Apache leaders including Taza. He argued that enforcement would require perpetual military occupation at enormous cost, that resistance would be fierce and justified, that the human toll would stain the nation's honor for generations. The memo was read at the policy meeting where decisions were made. Sam wasn't invited, junior analysts never were, but Harrison attended and reported back. "They read your memo," Harrison said, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who'd seen this scene play out too many times. "Every word. There was actually a moment where I thought they might listen, might consider an alternative approach. What happened? Senator Callahan from Mississippi stood up and said, "With all due respect to Mr. Garrett's extensive research, this policy isn't about what's right or practical. It's about what's necessary for American expansion. The Apache have land we need, resources we need, territory we need for railroads and settlements. Either they adapt to our civilization or they move aside. Those are the only options that matter." Harrison poured whiskey into 2 glasses. The policy was approved unanimously. Sam took the whiskey and downed it in one burning swallow. "So that's it. Everything I've done, everything I've documented, all the testimony and translation and witnessing, none of it matters because they've decided it doesn't matter." "Not quite." Harrison refilled both glasses. "Your work matters to the people it reached, the readers, the reformers, the ones who'll keep fighting after this battle is lost. And it'll matter in the future, when the policy fails as catastrophically as you predicted, and people ask why no one saw it coming. You'll be able to say, someone did see it coming, someone warned them, someone tried. Is that enough, being right when it's too late to matter?" "It has to be." Harrison raised his glass. "To being right too early, the occupational hazard of having principles in politics." They drank in silence. Outside the window, Washington went about its business. Senators and lobbyists and clerks and soldiers, all playing their roles in a system that kept rolling forward, regardless of consequences. Sam thought about Taza, about Danahe, about the 12 hunters whose scalped bodies had started this whole journey years ago, in a desert that felt like another world now. The new policy was implemented in the fall of 1852. Army units were dispatched to enforce it, and the results were exactly what Sam had predicted: fierce resistance, guerrilla warfare, massive costs in money and lives. Taza and his warriors fought brilliantly, using their knowledge of the terrain to inflict disproportionate casualties on larger forces. But there were always more soldiers, more resources, more determination to win at any cost. Sam followed the conflict through official reports and letters from Vasquez, who still maintained his neutral trading post despite increasing pressure from both sides. The news was uniformly grim. Villages destroyed, families scattered, warriors killed or captured, children taken to boarding schools designed to civilize them by erasing their culture. In the summer of 1854, Vasquez's letters stopped coming. Sam wrote to contacts in El Paso and learned that the trading post had been raided, not by Apache, but by settlers who decided Vasquez's neutrality was actually collaboration with the enemy. The old man had been beaten badly, his store looted, his decades of careful relationship building destroyed in one violent afternoon. He'd survived, but left for Mexico, no longer willing to risk his life for a peace that neither side seemed to want. Without Vasquez's neutral ground, communication between Sam and Taza ended. Sam didn't know if the war chief was alive or dead, still fighting or captured, maintaining resistance or accepting defeat. The official reports claimed Apache resistance was being systematically reduced, which could mean anything from total victory to wishful thinking. Sam requested a leave of absence and returned to the Southwest for the first time in 5 years. What he found broke his heart. The landscape hadn't changed. The desert was still beautiful and brutal, the mountains still majestic, but the human geography was unrecognizable. Apache lands were being carved up into ranches and mining claims. The trails where warriors once moved freely were now patrolled by soldiers. Trading posts like Vasquez's, places where different worlds had met peacefully, were being replaced by military forts and settler towns that flew one flag and recognized one law. In El Paso, Mary was still running her store, now expanded and more prosperous, but somehow sadder. She welcomed Sam with a long embrace and then gave him the news he'd been dreading. "Taza is dead," she said quietly. "Killed 6 months ago in a skirmish near the Pecos. The army recovered his body and buried it at Fort Bliss, said it was the honorable thing to do for a worthy opponent. Some of his warriors retrieved it a week later and buried him again in a secret location. Probably somewhere in the mountains he loved. Sam sat down heavily. He'd known this was likely. Men who lived by violence rarely died peacefully. But hearing it confirmed felt like losing something essential. Taza had been the thread connecting Sam's ideals to reality, proof that honor and intelligence and dignity could exist even in the brutal calculus of frontier war. "Did he have any final words?" Sam asked. "Any message?" "Not that I heard. But his warriors spread a story after his death, that just before he died, he said the land would remember everything, that the stones and wind would carry the truth long after everyone involved was dust." Mary smiled sadly. "Very Apache. They don't think in terms of individual lives, but in geological time. We all die, but the land remains, and the land remembers." Sam spent 2 weeks traveling through the territories he'd tried to help protect, documenting what the new policies had wrought. He filled notebooks with statistics on displaced families, closed trading posts, broken treaties, environmental destruction from new mining operations. He interviewed everyone, soldiers who felt guilty about their orders, settlers who insisted they were just trying to make a living, Apache survivors hiding in increasingly remote locations, missionaries trying to save souls while their government destroyed bodies. The picture was comprehensive and damning. The policy was working exactly as its architects intended. Apache resistance was being crushed, land was being opened for exploitation, American civilization was spreading across territories that had resisted it for centuries. But the human cost was staggering, the moral cost even higher. Sam compiled everything into a report that was over 200 pages long. He titled it The Apache Question, A History of Policy, Practice, and Consequence. He sent copies to everyone he could think of: Congress, newspapers, reformer organizations, military officials, religious leaders. He poured everything he'd learned over 15 years into this one document, hoping that somehow, somewhere, it would change someone's mind. Most of the responses were polite dismissals. A few were hostile accusations that he was undermining American interests. One senator returned his copy with a note: "History will vindicate our policies. Your bleeding heart will be forgotten." But there were also letters of support from abolitionists who saw connections between slavery and Indian policy, from military officers tired of fighting wars they didn't believe in, from young writers and thinkers who represented a new generation, questioning old certainties, and from Grace Hutchinson, now in her 80s and still planting seeds. "You did not save the Apache. Neither did I. But we documented the truth. And truth has a way of surviving even when justice doesn't. Your work will matter to people not yet born. That has to be enough." In 1855, exhausted and disillusioned, Sam resigned from the Office of Indian Affairs. Harrison accepted his resignation with genuine sadness and a final piece of advice: "Don't stop writing. Everything you learned here, everything you witnessed, write it down, publish it, preserve it. The system won't change because of your words, but your words might help someone understand why it should change." Sam returned to El Paso and took up residence in a small house near Mary's store. He spent his days helping with the store and his evenings writing. A comprehensive history of the Apache Wars, a collection of Denahe's writings with additional commentary, essays on frontier policy and moral failure. He published what he could and archived the rest, hoping that someday, somehow, it would find an audience that could actually use it. He also started teaching again, this time focusing on history. He wanted young people to understand that the world they'd inherited wasn't inevitable, that choices had been made, that different paths had existed. Rosa, his former student, was now a young woman teaching her own classes in Spanish and English. She sometimes invited Sam to speak to her students about the frontier's history. "Tell them the truth," she always said, "not the story in the textbooks about manifest destiny and civilization. Tell them what really happened," and Sam did. He told them about 12 hunters who got what they deserved, about a war chief who fought for his sister's laughter, about soldiers who died enforcing policies they didn't believe in, about settlers and traders caught between worlds, about bureaucrats who knew what was right but lacked power to do it. He told them history was made by humans making choices, and that meant different choices could have been made. Some students listened carefully. Others dismissed him as a bitter old man stuck in the past. But a few, always a few, would come back after class with questions, would borrow his unpublished writings, would start asking uncomfortable questions about the stories they'd been taught. Seeds, always planting seeds. In 1860, as the nation hurtled toward civil war over slavery, Sam received an unexpected visitor, a young Apache man, maybe 25, who introduced himself as Nietzsche, Taza's nephew, training to be a war leader. He'd heard about Sam from the warriors who'd been present at various meetings over the years. He'd come to El Paso specifically to find him. "My uncle spoke of you," Nietzsche said in accented but clear English. "He said you were a white man who tried to understand rather than conquer, who used words as weapons when others used bullets. He said you failed, but failure with honor was better than success without it." They sat in Sam's small house, drinking coffee and talking about Taza's legacy. Nietzsche explained that Apache resistance continued, smaller now, more strategic, focused on survival rather than victory. They'd adapted to the new reality, learning to navigate between Mexican and American authorities, maintaining enough strength to be respected, but not enough to be seen as existential threats. "We will never go back to how things were," Nietzsche said. "That world is gone, but we will not disappear either. We will adapt, survive, remember. And when people ask what happened to the Apache, there will be Apache alive to tell them, we're still here." Before leaving, Nietzsche gave Sam a final gift from Taza. A letter the war chief had written years earlier and entrusted to another warrior for eventual delivery. Sam opened it with trembling hands and read words written in Taza's careful, educated script. "Sam, if you're reading this, I am dead. The manner of death doesn't matter. In battle, from disease, from age, if I'm lucky. What matters is what comes after. You tried to help my people, you failed, but your failure was honest, and that counts for something. The world you wanted to create, where different peoples coexist with mutual respect, is not possible in our time. Maybe not in any time, but the fact that someone wanted it, tried for it, documented the attempt, that matters. History remembers the victors, but it also remembers the witnesses. Be a good witness. Tell the truth about what was done and why. And if someone in the future reads your words and chooses differently because of them, then neither of us failed completely. The land remembers everything. So do the people who love it. We will not be forgotten." Taza Sam sat alone for a long time after Nietzsche left, holding that letter and thinking about 15 years of work that had produced so little tangible change. The Apache was still being destroyed, just more slowly than the original policy intended. Settlers still came, still took land, still believed they had the right to reshape the world according to their vision. The cycle continued, and Sam was just one aging man with a pile of manuscripts that few people would read, but seeds, always seeds. He continued writing until his death in 1879, producing volumes of history and analysis and testimony that were largely ignored during his lifetime. But they were preserved, first in archives, then in libraries, eventually in academic studies. Historians began citing his work in the early 1900s, noting his unusual perspective and detailed documentation. By the 1960s, as Americans began confronting their nation's history of conquest and genocide, Sam's writings found a new audience, people looking for honest accounts of what had been done and why. His translation of Danai's story was republished multiple times, each edition reaching new readers. His analysis of frontier policy informed modern scholarship on indigenous rights and federal trust responsibilities. His documentation of specific events, the Hunter's execution, the Canyon Massacre, the systematic destruction of Apache society, became part of the historical record impossible to ignore or deny. And somewhere in those writings, preserved across decades and read by millions who never knew his name, Sam's essential argument survived. The world has space for many peoples and many ways of living. The problem has never been diversity. It's been the belief that one group has the right to dominate all others, that might makes right, that conquest can be dressed up as civilization and violence as progress. The seeds he planted grew slowly, in soil fertilized by other people's work, watered by later generations' commitment to justice. They didn't grow into the world Sam had hoped for. That world remained as elusive as ever, but they grew into understanding, into consciousness, into the knowledge that the past didn't have to be inevitable and the future didn't have to repeat it. In the canyon near El Paso, on a mesa overlooking territory where Apache warriors once moved freely, there's now a small monument. It lists the names of those killed in frontier conflicts, soldiers, settlers, traders, and Apache warriors, including Taza. And at the bottom, in smaller letters, "The land remembers everything. Let us remember honestly." Sam would have liked that.
I'm freezing. I'm bleeding. Slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile. Every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here. Maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, know it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay. They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. If I never met you, maybe I would know just how to heal, but now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true.